Hello everyone, Bag here. The neglected child of 3.2, Anaxa, is next on the docket for Star Rail's banner cycle. So before you decide whether or not to get him, you must first figure out how well your account can make use of him. So, with that in mind, let's waste no time at all and get straight into things. First, let's briefly talk about what Anaxa needs from his teams, as it's rather simple. He has two playstyles that he can be played in. Thanks to his second trace, he either gets a large amount of crit damage when played in a solo erudition hypercarry build, or he can give team-wide damage percent by being a sub DPS with another erudition unit. In both of these scenarios, he is a rather typical DPS in terms of his needs from his team. So let me just quickly point out some key factors that are worth noting. For one, Anaxa is very attack starved, with a large amount of conditional crit damage and a very large amount of damage percent in multiple parts of his kit. So unlike the massive HP scaling carries, attack bestowers are at a slight advantage here. He also is incentivized to spam his ultimate quite often, as it temporarily giving 7 weaknesses to the enemy for one turn lets him better stack up his implants onto the enemy by immediately getting access to his double skill usage. So from that, energy funneling units are also pretty nice on him. As I just mentioned, Anaxa also has a bit of a ramp up time to get to his full damage, as he maxes out his defense shred from his trace after all 7 elements are implanted onto an enemy. So giving him a high frequency of turns helps shorten the amount of time that it takes to get to his optimal damage. So as with most hypercarries, action advances are a core part of what makes him work. Besides that, in a hypercarry scenario, he is rather standard, outside of the fact that his bounce attack skill makes him workable in high and low enemy count fights. But that is mostly irrelevant when building teams for him, other than a few notable cases. As for his dual DPS teams, well, there's no real way to generalize him there, and you'll see what I mean by that when we get there. As we start the list, let's go into his first team slot, the Action Advancer. For the majority of this video, we'll be looking at teammates in a hypercarry setting, so if you just care about his dual DPS prospects, then skip to this time. In any case, surprise surprise everyone, but Sunday is the best one here, for a few relatively straightforward reasons. For one, this is the first character in a while in these teammate tier lists that actually uses skill points, meaning that Sunday's SP positive-ishness is noticeably impactful. The flat 40 energy from Sunday's ultimate is also pretty important for keeping up Anaxa's ultimate rotation. Anaxa builds energy very quickly for himself due to casting 2 skills that each give him 30 energy. So in a -1 speed setup, 4 skills plus a Sunday ultimate is enough to charge him from 0 to full. Of course, you won't be getting a Sunday ultimate every turn, but the impact that it makes when it is up is still felt. For most of the reason why Sunday is strong is just really in that same reasoning for why action advances are strong for him in general, where he is then the strongest in that category. Doubling Anaxa's turns, doubling the energy he generates through doubling his turns, cutting his implant ramp up time in half through, you guessed it, doubling his turns, these are all quintessential functions for a hypercarry Anaxa, and Sunday just flat out does it the best. However, let's not discredit Bronya here, as on top of her having a lot of the same base level benefits as Sunday, she actually does have the leg up on him in one key place. Spoiler alert, but Robin is pretty dang good with Anaxa, and Bronya has the semi-unique ability to instantly action advance Robin to get her into her ultimate state at the start of the fight. This can then lead to the first Robin ultimate ending within the first cycle of the first wave, which could then mean a 0 action value Robin ult into the second wave, depending on how well her energy is being funneled by both her team and by being hit. Sunday can do the same thing with ulting Robin on his first turn, but not ulting Anaxa with Sunday really messes up his buffing and SP generation, so I wouldn't really say that's that feasible. There's also the classic E2 Bronya tech of having attack boots on Anaxa, where you miss the first Anaxa turn of the fight waiting for Bronya to apply the 30% speed buff, and then so long as Bronya never misses a skill, you can have an effective -1 speed setup with attack boots, which is very nice. But on the other hand, the SP issues with Bronya are rather felt, and while Anaxa using his basic is not the worst thing in the world, since he does get his free skill immediately afterwards, so long as the 5 needed implants are there, and thanks to his first trace, he still gets a total of 30 energy even when using his basic, it is still a rather large DPS loss. Since Robin is the best way to make the most out of Bronya, and she's pretty lacking in generating SP, you really need large SP generation from your last slot, which just means Gallagher, which then might make your team weaker if he is replacing a sustain with more direct offensive utility. Still, I would say that she is really good with Anaxa, and for what it's worth, her E4 also benefits from his wind implants, if that matters to you. I'd say she should be in the A tier, but likely at the top end of it. Sparkle, meanwhile, falls a bit behind Bronya here, as while the SP issues are mostly gone with her, the lack of any enemy, Bronya's synergy with Robin, and the overall less amount of turns makes her just a bit weaker in my opinion. Bronya's main disadvantage of SP generation has avenues that you can take to counteract it, while Sparkle will always have her weakness of just giving less turns than an optimal -1 speed setup. This is even more true with Robin, since a team-wide Robin action advance makes Sparkle's action advance useless, while that same scenario doesn't mess with a -1 speed setup at all. I'd still put Sparkle in the A tier, but more near the bottom of it. Let's next move on to the sustaining options, as things are rather standard here. Aventurine is the most generalist option for non-SP intensive offensive utility, with his personal damage and ultimate debuff, but Ho-Ho can also be very competitive with her incredibly useful attack and energy buffs. Ho-Ho is much more feasible to use if you have the SP generation needed for her basic skill basic rotation, so her viability mostly depends on the comp. Overall though, I would put Ho-Ho into the S tier and Aventurine in the A tier, as while Ho-Ho is harder to make work, her boons with funneling Anaxa, Robin, and Sunday is just too good to really downplay. Then we get to the less exciting sustains. Fushuan is a slightly lesser Aventurine with powerful offensive utility, but a much larger reliance on occasional SP generation, so I think it fits her well to be at the bottom of the A tier. Luocha is a really good healer that doesn't really do anything else here, so B tier. As for Lingsha, well, here's where we get to an oddity in Anaxa's kit, as his implants makes him rather good at stopping the enemies from attacking in the first place. We'll cover what that means for sustainless comps in a bit, but for Lingsha, this means that her fire toughness damage is very useful due to his implant, making her better than usual at sustaining and breaking. Still, with no super break to boost her damage, and no other offensive utility other than the fact that broken enemies take more damage, I think this just firmly places her into the A tier, nothing more, nothing less. And then we get to the other sustains with no real special synergy with Anaxa, besides Gallagher, who I already noted as being important depending on the SP generation of the team. He can go to the top of the A tier with Bronya. Everyone else, go to where you always go in these tier lists. I'm not gonna waste any more time on you. A quick plug here to ask to subscribe. I'm very close to 10k and I would really appreciate if you help me jump that last hurdle. Most of my regular audience is not subscribed, so if you are a repeat viewer, check to see if you've actually clicked subscribe. Okay, enough shilling, back to the video. And for the final team slot, we've got many more units to talk about than in the last few videos, since this time we can't write off the attack scaling supports. Let's knock out all of the D to low A tier supports out in one go in a lightning round. Silver Wolf, no. Her implants are more than worthless here, and Anaxa likes to hit in AoE. Yes, he can work in single target, and yes, her defense shred works well with his own, but the likes of Pela and Jiaoshu are much better at supporting him in that facet. Yukong, no. She is way too SP intensive to be relevant here, and his fast attacking playstyle does not lend well at all to her skill stack generation. Black Swan, no. Again, Pela is better here for AoE defense shredding. Asta and Hanya? Well, they give good speed and attack, and they can each DDD pretty well, so I wouldn't call them bad in a synergistic sense. Really, the only reason that they are low here is just because the sheer quantity and quality of buffs that they give are just lower than a lot of the other cheaper options these days. They aren't bad, but just underwhelming. But if you are desperate for teammates, then they are somewhat usable. Ting Yun is in that mid category of being one of the better free-to-play options, but just so far below the better buffing competition. She is stuck halfway between the underwhelming Asta and Hanya and the turbo buffers that are above her. Still, attack buffs, energy buffs, DDD, okay SP generation, she is by no means bad at all. But in today's age of higher and higher cost teams, these 4-star options really need something specifically good about them to get above the B tier. Pela and Jiaoshu are a case of having that special sauce, since their respective vulnerability and defense shredding lines up very well with Anaxa's own def shred. This I Summon video is the holy grail of understanding how this works, but essentially, mixing def shred and vulnerability, as well as stacking def shred on top of itself, is a very good avenue to buff damage, which makes these two as options better than usual in a pure damage sense. What they lose out on is what they usually lose out on, a lack of action advancing or energy, meaning that while Anaxa's damage will be high, he'll be doing less actions and less ultimates per cycle, which is hard to justify. Ranmei is odd. Like usual, she is paired with Jiaoshu and Pela in that generic damage amping niche, but because of Anaxa's implants, high toughness damage, and stun interrupt in his ult, you can actually try to slot in Ranmei in a sustainless comp, where her weakness break efficiency and re-breaking of the enemy becomes her selling point. It, very obviously, depends on the enemy and their mechanics to see how feasible a sustainless comp can be, but Anaxa Anaxa has the tools in his kit to be better than the average hypercarry at running it. In this, Ranmei excels as that last piece of that puzzle. We can also mention Welt here as well in that same position, as his ultimate can also act as a stun or interrupt, and his slows can help to stave off enemies as well. But not only is he just much worse at amping damage, but he is also rather skill point intensive to get his slows and ultimates off, which makes him unfortunately much less appealing. Still doable, but much less recommendable. Now we have the heavy hitters, starting with the last of the A tiers, RMC. Now, RMC has been at the top of the last few teammate tier lists, and in a pure vacuum, there really isn't that much of a reason for him to drop to the top of the A tier. Instead, the real difference maker between performance with Anaxa and someone like Maide is just the sheer competition that he faces. HP scalers have less options, so RMC's general strength is much more coveted, but with Robin, Pela, and Joshi being far less behind, and RMC's buff having shaky uptime with how many turns Anaxa wants to take, and yeah, in my opinion, RMC is just great, not super great. Tribi is the next for her designated AoE niche, and since Anaxa attacks twice with his skill, that's double the procs for Tribi's additional damage and energy, which is very nice. And besides that, well, as usual, she has the top tier damage buffs, DDD, and sizable personal damage in an AoE setting. Really, Tribi works well with any Erudition unit, or really most units in general, so her being at the top here should not really be a surprise in the slightest. But she's not at the top, as that goes, of course, to Robin. With team-wide action advances that also action advances other action advancers optimally in a -1 speed setup, she can beat out any amount of DDDing in terms of giving Anaxa as many turns as possible within a cycle. She also has very important and impactful attack scaling, giving Anaxa the exact stat that he wants the most. So Tribi's universal damage boosting is for once disadvantaged compared to the curated buff that works specifically well for Anaxa. The double skill also works to proc Robin's additional damage and energy twice, and Robin's additional damage being single target also works well for when Anaxa is being played in a low enemy count scenario. Robin has been in the backseat for the last 2 carries, but here she's back where she belongs at the top of the list. Now, I do want to mention that between Sunday and Bronya, or more so with Robin and Tribi, that Anaxa's best team is not that rigid to perform well with. You don't need every best option to make him workable, but these top units are the pinnacle of the marginal improvements that you can give him. Now, we get to Anaxa's dual DPS potential, and you might be confused why this section of the video is kind of small. Well, let me break it down for you. Usually, when you bring a unit from a hypercarry comp to a dual DPS comp, they individually become weaker due to them having one less support amping their damage. Even with special synergy, something like a caster's dual DPS team still falls short to her hypercarry comp just due to lesser damage. The thing with Anaxa is that not only does the situation also apply to him, but he also loses extra damage thanks to his second trace. He loses 140% crit damage, with him instead giving the whole team 50 damage percent. This buff, on top of the number being less, is also just much worse for him due to how oversaturated he already is in damage percent, so his personal damage will kind of really fall off when paired with generic Erudition units. The only unit where this isn't the case is with the Herda, since her team-wide 80% crit damage buff partially makes up for Anaxa's loss. This lets you more easily benefit from his damage percent for the Herda's damage, making for a very powerful dual DPS team. The basic gist for this comp is that in 5 enemy scenarios, it'll do just about even with Jade teams, but in lower enemy scenarios, Anaxa will do much better. This is firstly due to his bounce attack only losing a bit of strength with less enemies, and also due to Jade losing out in a lot of stack generation with less enemies. So if you already have Jade for the Herda, Anaxa is not a flat out improvement, but there are situations where he can usurp Jade, especially if you, say, want to use her in your other Pure Fiction team or something like that. For every other Erudition unit, it is generally better to play Anaxa in a hypercarry comp instead, as the lesser personal damage just makes it so much more difficult for him to perform. If you want to use Jade, it can work, especially since the 30 speed that she gives can justify attack boots on him, similar to E2 Bronya, which again helps to somewhat shore up his damage in the same way as the Herda does for him. He is also very good at funneling stacks for Jade with his double skill and frequent ultimate, but in general, it's still iffy to forego his hypercarry playstyle when Jade is already so good at working well with cheaper options such as mini Herda. It really just comes down to how well your Jade is invested invested into. If Anaxa buffing her damage is impactful enough to make up for Anaxa's lower personal damage, then using them together might be worth trying out. But otherwise, I would expect a hypercarry Anaxa to be more justifiable to run in most given scenarios. I will also be transparent in saying that this is likely to depend on a lot of other variable factors, such as the elemental resists of the enemies, the rotation buffs for a given pure fiction, and what two teams you can make out of your account's resources. So I won't ever call them not worth using together, it's just a bit sus unless if you can really justify it. And for every other erudition unit, yeah, he doesn't really hold a candle to Jade in dual DPSing potential. Obviously, also for his dual DPS teams, the supports in this tier will look a lot different. Tribi and Robin would surpass Sunday, while every single target buffing support in general goes way down. But I already wouldn't say that Anaxa would change how you generally build teams for the Herda in the first place, besides mentioning that the core of Pela, Jiaoshu, and Sustainless Ranmei are better than usual. Before we end things, there are other niches that I want to briefly touch on. Firstly, Break Anaxa. Due to his aforementioned toughness damage and implants, it might be enticing to use him in a pseudo break team in the same way as you might do with Himiko. The short answer is that generally this is worse than a crit build for him, as unlike Himiko, Anaxa is not actually losing any utility by breaking or not breaking. But in Apocalyptic Shadow, or any fight that really just wants him to break for the mechanics of the fight, the toughness damage support from break supports might be worth considering. It's more of a for fun thing without heavy premium investment, but people would ask in the comments if it wasn't in the video, so I thought I'd mention it. And the last thing to mention is Cipher. Now, like when I talked about Castris in my My Day video, take everything here with a gigantic grain of salt, as not only are we still early in our understanding of her, but it is also only the start of the pre-release cycle, and things can and definitely will change. But for right now, yeah, Cipher is actually very solid for Anaxa, as she has that ever-important omnipresent defense shred on top of sizable true damage support that can compete very well with RMC. In lower enemy count fights, Cipher's stack generation will work much better with Anaxa's bounce attack, so that is to say that their synergy is highly variable. But no matter what, she is at the very least a much better Pela with actual personal damage, and her 30% def shred will always work with Anaxa's kit. So for now, I will put her at the top of the A tier, but by the time Cipher actually releases, I expect this to change at least somewhat. With that, that's the list. I did not expect this video to be nearly the same length as the Castris one, but with a unit as multifaceted as Anaxa, I guess I just be like that sometimes. I feel like I've only scratched the surface when talking about the actual complexity to his playstyle and inner workings, but that talk will mostly be saved for the Anaxa guide, which is coming up next. Until then, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!